Good afternoon. Today's session is entitled Global Solutions to an Unprecedented Demand. My name is Anil Rustgi, and I have the honor of making some welcoming remarks for today's session. I also have the honor of serving as the director of the Irving Cancer Center, as well as the interim dean and interim executive vice president at our medical center. There's no doubt that with all the changing and shifting landscape nationally and internationally, that solutions are imperative and even more so in terms of implementation. At Columbia's Medical Center, I believe we are contributing and continue to contribute to solutions that can be extended globally. First and foremost is fundamental aspects of clinical care, from the emergency department setting to the inpatient setting, and in particular to the intensive care unit setting. Second is the development, characterization, and implementation of antibodies, antibody cocktails, so to speak, in the acute setting. Third is various strategies for testing. And fourth is understanding the efficacy of different vaccines, especially in the context of COVID-19 variants. So with that in mind, I look forward to today's session and welcome our moderator today, Dr. Philip Larussa, who's professor of pediatrics in the Division of Infectious Diseases. Dr. Larussa, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rustgi, and thank you for those remarks. I want to welcome all the attendees to today's session. It's really an honor to moderate such an illustrious group of speakers. Remember that the name of this, the title of the session is Global Solutions to an Unprecedented Demand. And I think the two important words here are global and unprecedented. And you're going to hear a lot of that today in the different presentations. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who's Dr. Tedros, who is the Director General of the WHO and has been since May of 2017. Before that, he was Ethiopia's Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2012 to 2016. And Ethiopia's Minister of Health from 2005 to 2012. And he will speak to us on the role of the WHO in COVID vaccine development and distribution. Thank you, Dr. Tedros. I think you may be on mute, Dr. Tedros.
Yeah.
That's good.
Now?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Philip. And thank you, Anil. Good morning and good afternoon to all of you. And thank you for the invitation to speak to you today. And I'm very glad to be back at Columbia, albeit virtually. As you know, the first major speech I gave after my election as Director General in 2017 was at the World Leaders Forum at Columbia on the subject of health security. I began my remarks by describing the 1918 flu pandemic, which erupted during the First World War. And although it killed more people than the war itself, the pandemic was quickly forgotten and its lessons went unheeded. I said then that a devastating epidemic could start in any country at any time and kill millions of people because we are not prepared. I said that global health security is only as strong as its weakest link, and no one is safe until we're all safe. And I said that we do not know where or when the next global pandemic will occur, but we do know that it will exact a terrible toll on human life and on the global economy. It gives me no pleasure that the COVID-19 pandemic matches the scenario I outlined that day so closely when I spoke in Columbia University. I wish I was wrong. But WHO has been ringing the alarm bell for years, and many others too. Before the COVID-19 pandemic struck, people would often ask me what kept me awake at night. I would answer without hesitation, a global pandemic of a respiratory virus. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated that indeed the world was not prepared. More than 110 million cases of COVID-19 have now been reported to WHO from around the world, and more than 2.5 million people have lost their lives. But we do see signs of hope. Globally, the number of reported cases has now declined for 6 consecutive weeks, and the number of deaths has declined for 3 weeks in a row. This trend is a reminder that even though we're discussing vaccines today, COVID-19 can be suppressed and controlled with proven public health measures. And indeed, that's exactly what many countries have done. We must remember that although this is a global pandemic, not all countries have responded in the same way, and not all countries have been affected in the same way. One of the greatest tragedies of the pandemic is that since it started, the whole world has had the tools to control it, but not all countries have used them effectively. It's important to emphasize that even as vaccines start to roll out around the world, vaccines will complement and not replace the public health measures that we know work. But there is no question that vaccines are the shot in the arm we all need, literally and metaphorically. The development and approval of safe and effective vaccines less than a year after the emergence of a new virus is an incredible scientific achievement that must change our expectations for what is possible in future vaccine development. I would like to pay tribute to the researchers, trial participants, and public-private partnerships that have made this possible. The lightning speed at which COVID-19 vaccines have been developed is no accident. In fact, it has been years in the making. As Tony Fauci said during our WHO media briefing yesterday, much of the basic science underpinning these vaccines was done years ago as part of the quest for a vaccine against HIV. For WHO, part of the story of COVID-19 vaccines goes back to the West African Ebola outbreak from 2014 to 2016. Although the Ebola virus had been identified 4 decades earlier, and despite years of academic and biodefense research, there were no proven Ebola vaccines, and research had stalled at the preclinical level. In response, WHO brought together a global consortium to facilitate the rapid development and evaluation of several vaccine candidates. In Guinea, we coordinated an innovative phase 3 trial and hired and trained national staff to conduct it. 4 months later, preliminary efficacy data were announced. By that stage, the outbreak was waning, and the vaccines arrived too late to benefit the majority of those affected. But the vaccines developed then have been a vital tool in subsequent and current simultaneous but unrelated Ebola outbreaks in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and Guinea. In fact, Ebola vaccination in Guinea started today, and vaccination in DRC began last week. The West African Ebola outbreak gave rise to vaccines, but it also gave rise to WHO's research and development blueprint for epidemics, a strategy to facilitate the rapid development of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics in response to outbreaks. The research and development blueprint, published in 2016, defined a list of priority diseases, including SARS, MERS, and coronaviruses in general, as well as the unknown pathogen called Disease X, and established a research roadmap for each of them. One of the first roadmaps developed was for the MERS coronavirus, which had at that time infected 1,600 people and caused almost 600 deaths. Much of the work done on developing vaccines for MERS laid the groundwork for the development of vaccines against the new coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. As you know, on New Year's Eve 2019, WHO was notified of a cluster of cases of pneumonia of unknown cause in Wuhan, China. Within 2 weeks, Chinese researchers identified a novel coronavirus at the cause of the outbreak and sequenced and published its genome. The same week, WHO held the first of a series of calls of the Global Coordination Mechanism for Research and Development. Then in February last year, WHO brought together more than 300 leading researchers from around the world in line with the R&D blueprint to identify and accelerate a research roadmap for COVID-19. By April, WHO had published a range of products to guide vaccine development, including target product profiles, core protocols for vaccine trials, animal models, assays, and more. And we have continued to track vaccine development globally. Most recently, WHO has provided emergency use listing for 3 vaccines, including the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine and 2 versions of the AstraZeneca vaccine. WHO emergency use listing gives the green light for COVAX to buy vaccines and enables countries to expedite their own regulatory approval to import and roll out vaccines. But as we often say, it's not vaccines that save lives, it's vaccinations. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we knew that vaccines would be a vital tool for controlling it. But we also knew from experience that the equitable distribution of vaccines would not just happen. Antiretrovirals for HIV were first approved in 1996. But more than a decade passed before the world's poor got access to them. In the same way, when the H1N1 pandemic erupted in 2009, vaccines were developed, but by the time the poor got access, the pandemic was over. So in April last year, with support from France, Germany, the European Commission, and a coalition of partners, including Gavi, CEPI, WHO, and others, we launched the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator. The aims of the ACT Accelerator were twofold: to facilitate the rapid and development of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics for COVID-19, and to distribute them equitably. The first objective has been achieved. The second is in jeopardy. At the beginning of the year, I issued a call to action to ensure that vaccination of health workers and older people is underway in all countries within the first 100 days of this year. So far, more than 210 million doses of vaccine have been administered globally. More than half are in just 2 countries, and more than 80% are in 10 countries. But I'm pleased to say that the first shipments of doses through COVAX are being sent today. And I hope my friend Seth will give you more information. But many countries are yet to administer a single dose. We understand that governments have an obligation to protect their own people. But the best way to do that is by suppressing the virus everywhere at the same time. The more the virus circulates, the more opportunity it has to mutate in ways that could render vaccines less effective. We could end up back at square one. And in our interconnected world, the longer the pandemic persists anywhere, the longer global trade and travel will be disrupted, and the longer the recovery will take. Vaccine equity is not just a moral imperative. It's an economic and strategic imperative. It's in every country's own best interest. WHO and our partners in the ACT Accelerator have laid the groundwork. We have created a dose sharing mechanism, set up rapid processes for emergency use listing, set up indemnification and no-fault compensation mechanisms, and completed readiness assessments in almost all countries. Through our 150 country offices, we have been working closely with countries to prepare them to roll out vaccines as rapidly as possible. This is great news, but we still face significant challenges to realize the promise of the ACT Accelerator and COVAX. First, we still face a financing gap of at least $22.9 billion for the ACT Accelerator this year. Last week, G7 countries committed $4.3 billion in new funding, and several countries committed to sharing doses with COVAX. This is very welcome, but we need all countries to step up. The longer this gap goes unmet, the harder it becomes to understand why, given this is a tiny fraction of the trillions of dollars that have been mobilized for stimulus packages. Second, we call on all countries to respect COVAX contracts and not compete with them. Some countries continue to sign bilateral deals while other countries have nothing. We continue to hear about high-income countries that express support for COVAX in public, but in private, enter contracts that undermine it by offering higher prices, and reducing the number of doses COVAX can buy. And third, we need an urgent scale-up in manufacturing to increase the volume of vaccines. That means innovative partnerships, including tech transfer, licensing, and other mechanisms to address production bottlenecks. None of these challenges is insurmountable. The world has already proven that in the face of an unprecedented threat, we can do unprecedented things. With proven public health measures, rapid diagnostics, oxygen, dexamethasone, and vaccines, we have all the tools we need to bring the pandemic under control. Whether we do is not a test of science. It is a test of character. Thank you again, Phil, and back to you.
Thank you, Director General Tedros. That was a wonderful speech, and you brought in all the elements that we're worried about, the idea of addressing this global situation and also of equitable access to vaccines and other initiatives that will make it possible to control the epidemic. And we thank you for your leadership. I'd like to, is Dr. Lurie with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Great.
Well, I wonder if it might be better sequencing for Dr. Berkley to go first, but we can do it either way.
Well, let's do you, and then we can.
Sounds great. Good.
So, Dr. Lurie is the strategic advisor to the CEO and response lead at the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, and she's also a senior lecturer at Harvard Medical School. She's going to talk to us about vaccine nationalism, global preparedness, and delivery. Thank you, Dr. Lurie.
Great. No, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. And thank you, Dr. Tedros, for those terrific comments. And, also such a powerful reminder about the bread and butter public health tools that are essential to controlling this pandemic. I think as you come in, it's so easy for us to focus solely on vaccines and forget about all of the other interventions. And in fact, the nationalistic behavior that we, see around vaccines also in some sense applies to the kinds of behaviors around other public health interventions and lack thereof, and only contributes to spread. So I'm going to make a few comments about vaccine nationalism in general, and just start by just observing, I think in the US, the need for, or the sense of a need for domestic vaccine self-sufficiency isn't a new concept, as Dr. Tedros identified, but actually goes way back to the Chiron vaccine disaster, at least in 2004, if not before. And so pandemic planning in the US always focused on vaccine self-sufficiency, to the point that, as Dr. Tedros mentioned, in H1N1, the US had bought up all of the manufacturing around the world for H1N1, and it caused really tremendous problems. Ultimately, the US agreed to share doses and donate doses to WHO. And at that time, or after that time, it took a good 6 months from that decision to when vaccine doses actually made it to another country. And again, as Dr. Tedros said, way too late. So countries vowed to do better around the world and act on lessons learned from that. And so what did they do? They made lots and lots of bilateral deals with companies for flu vaccine, didn't necessarily recognize that another important lesson of that was that poor countries in the world were left out. And so then, as it did for flu, when COVID started, many of the high-income countries in the world again said, well, we're going to use our flu plan. We're going to make bilateral deals for COVID vaccine, again, with nowhere near enough attention to the consequences of the rest of the world. So it's that behavior where countries push to get first access to a supply of vaccines, potentially hoarding lots of key components along the way, is what's referred to as vaccine nationalism. And as we know, it creates incredible inequalities and inefficiencies, inequities, drives up costs for everybody. So that while this is something we all decry, I think we also have to recognize that all sovereign leaders have a primary responsibility to take care of their citizens. But this needs to be balanced with a recognition that we're all interconnected. And whether your argument as a country leader is a self-interested one, keep a disease from getting to your own country, or an economic one, we think that it's going to help our economies recover faster. It's really clear we cannot all recover, or, without doing this together, that unbridled vaccine nationalism is inappropriate and negatively impacts global health security and is clearly impacting on ending this pandemic. So let's take a little closer look at what happened here. As COVID got started, lots of countries made lots of bilateral deals. Ultimately, COVAX, which Seth is going to talk about, was really formed as an end-to-end approach to try to deal with that, as we all came to recognize that there were many gaps in our vaccine development system. No entities to pay for manufacturing scale up, for raw materials, to make a commitment to buy vaccine other than these high-income countries. But the timing of all these bilateral deals has really posed some threats to COVAX and the rest of the world, because it appears as though all of those bilateral deals, or many, are getting satisfied before the deals that COVAX has been able to make. And that really, really compromises the ability now for COVAX, which is rolling out its first doses, as you heard today, to supply the rest of the world. And as Dr. Tedros noted, even as we speak, countries are trying to make bilateral deals, really undercutting what COVAX is intended to do. And I think that's really critical. I also want to point out that it's not just the deal part of this that is a part of vaccine nationalism, but we're watching some other parts of vaccine nationalism go on as well. And I want to highlight two of them, or three of them, frankly. One is regulatory nationalism, where regulatory entities in some countries are a little bit potentially taking regulatory action or jumping the gun in the hope that if they take those actions, they will get vaccine first, because the WHO pre-Q process, or a stringent regulatory agency process, hasn't worked itself out yet. That's something that we're seeing. I think as we got into the intense politics of this, it could be anticipated, but that we need to address. Secondly, again, as Dr. Tedros pointed out, but I want to note the acuity of this situation. An important part of vaccine nationalism has to do with the supply chain and raw materials for vaccines. And as we've seen and as we know right now, we can't achieve manufacturing at the scale that we want to, in part maybe because the capacity isn't there around the world, but mostly right now because the raw materials are being bought up and hoarded often by countries as well as by manufacturers. And that kind of hoarding and that kind of limitation and export of raw material is another form of vaccine nationalism that's really, really going to compromise the ability to scale up, get vaccine out there. And finally, we're seeing another kind of vaccine nationalism of the sort, and that's a kind of vaccine nationalism which has a really different slant and may have some positive benefits. And that's where we are seeing countries use vaccine and the ability to get vaccine out there as a tool of diplomacy. And we all have to recognize that vaccines are a bridge to health. Hopefully they can be used as a tool of diplomacy and not just a tool of raw economic power. So I think it's important that we learn really critical lessons from this adventure in vaccine nationalism that's been so challenging for us as we design a system for the future. What if this, if I think about this from our CEPI perspective, where CEPI has been responsible for R&D for vaccines and through that contracting process secured first doses for COVAX, we've been in a position where, well over 1 billion doses have been secured for COVAX for a right of first refusal. Had this been an influenza pandemic, or if there's one in the future, and we say, oh, gee, there's not a market failure, there's not an R&D failure, but pandemic flu vaccines start to get made. And in fact, there's no entity to make those advanced market commitments to do what COVAX and Gavi have done. We're going to see this vaccine nationalism all over again. So it's time that we're all starting to think about what the post-pandemic consensus is and where we need to go to design a system for the future. And clearly that system has to be designed so that the world acts in solidarity, so that we find a much more appropriate balance between a country's needs to protect its citizens and a very clear recognition that we're not safe until we're all safe. I'll just end by saying that this vaccine nationalism has incredible costs. There's been a terrific study from RAND Europe that talks about the cost to the world of vaccine nationalism, and points out now that for every dollar spent to support vaccine rollout for the world, even high-income countries get back close to $5 in benefits. In other words, the cost of vaccine nationalism is in the multiple trillions a year to the world. And none of us really want that for our future. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Lurie. We're going to go through the rest of the speakers and then we'll have a discussion. We have plenty of time for discussion and some questions. Our next speaker is Dr. Samba Sow. Dr. Sow is former Minister of Health of Mali and currently Director General for the Center of Vaccine Development in the Ministry of Health in Mali. And he was appointed by the Director General of the WHO as one of 6 special envoys to the WHO on COVID-19. And he will speak to us on the perspective on vaccine rollout in West Africa. Dr. Sow.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm sorry I have a very little bandwidth here, so I can't use video and just want to stay connected, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, so I will give my perspective on vaccine rollout in West Africa. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you again, Dr. Larussa for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak among such eminent colleagues today. I believe that we are at a critical juncture in Africa with the COVID-19 pandemic. We are seeing increases in death and overwhelmed health system, and often in countries with the infrastructure to properly record cases and respond. Deaths are being normalized and cases are going untested. But we know that COVID-19 is present and rapidly weakening our fragile health systems and unraveling the gains we have fought. We have fought so hard to achieve over the last few decades. I am seeing on the ground the rollout, the toll all this is taking on communities, on health workers, and subsequently on vulnerable populations. West Africa also has to deal with more than one pandemic. As well as COVID-19, we have a security epidemic in West Africa. And the threat of another Ebola epidemic that was very well mentioned by the DG, Dr. Tedros, WHO DG. And the truth is that COVID-19 has left us exposed, and that increases the chances of over health threats snowballing and costing us at least a decade or more of progress. However, not all is negative. The speed at which the COVID vaccines have been developed is staggering and inspiring, and the leadership involved in this has been incredible. I think we have learned a lesson about what is possible with true global collaboration. And this spirit of collaboration is still needed as we move to vaccine rollout. We have seen the damage done through politicization of COVID-19 pandemic. And now we face the same damage if we politicize the vaccines. Our success in defeating the pandemic globally will depend on successfully defeating the virus everywhere, which means that the vaccine rollout in the complex and increased Sahel region will have to be successfully implemented. In my career in the field involved in the trialing and development of vaccines, I have come to understand that the success of any vaccine and its rollout begins and ends with community. The importance of effective communication can never be underestimated. That is true. Now, more than ever in the infodemic that has accompanied the pandemic. When working on Ebola vaccine trial, there were times where community believed that we had come to infect them, and they understandably threatened our lives. It took time, patience, and working with those communities to overcome their fear and misunderstanding. So the COVID-19 vaccine will require the same patient community engagement to get the required uptake of a vaccine. Any vaccine campaign will also have to rely on a strong community health system rather than the current system of lurching from health crisis to health crisis. Each one further weakening the already fragile health system. This is the time to invest in our primary healthcare system. This is it. We have to do it now. It will be our community network who will be able to identify those at risk. We will able to reach those population and administer the vaccine. There are glaring issues though. One involves data. It is critical that we build sustainable and strong data system. I fear that we do not understand even now the reach of COVID-19 in Africa due to weak reporting systems and people dying in communities. If we are to reach the communities most vulnerable to COVID-19, we need to understand who and where these people are and ensure their vaccinations are recorded, especially if second doses are needed. Can we use this moment to start investing in robust data system, which will make our system, our health systems more resilient to future health crises? I know that the logistic will present problem too, but I also know that Africa has excelled at campaigns in the past. Again, though, I would ask that we make sure that any investment in COVID-19 vaccine campaign is also an investment in primary healthcare systems, so that across West Africa and across Africa, why not, a positive legacy from this pandemic and can build resilience for the future. Of course, all of this will depend on vaccine availability. WHO's call for vaccine equity is welcome. It isn't just important, it is crucial to ending the pandemic. And I thank them for their commitment to the principle of vaccine equity. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sow. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Seth Berkeley, who's the CEO of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunizations. And he's going to talk about the role of Gavi in preparedness, distribution, and access. Dr. Berkeley.
So thank you, Phil, and I really want to thank Tedros and Nikki and Samba, all of colleagues who we work closely with, and I know I'll be followed by Jeff. And like Tedros, I want to acknowledge the fact that it's nice to be back at Columbia. I used to teach years ago the infectious disease epidemiology course at the School of Public Health, and just 3 years ago gave the commencement address at the School of Public Health, where I talked about some of these issues and trust and using the technologies that Samba talked about to try to build stronger and resilient health systems. So it's great to be here with all of you. Tedros has already talked about the magnitude of the pandemic, but let me go beyond that and talk about the fault lines that have been created in the way we live, the inequalities in wealth, health, and social protection, access to basic systems that we heard Samba just talk about. You know, the poorest and most vulnerable are once again the hardest hit by the pandemic, and it's turned back decades of developmental progress, including on poverty eradication, nutrition, education, and health. Trillions of dollars have been lost. So I think, you know, we very rapidly began to ask the question, and it's funny because Nikki was talking about CEPI. I remember sitting in Davos about the time Tedros was talking about when the first cases were being talked about, and we began to discuss, could we put together a global approach? And to do this, the critical issue was to try to bring together a group of people. And the COVAX facility, with which Tedros has talked about, which is part of the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, is the vaccine pillar of that. And that is co-led by CEPI, Gavi, and WHO, but also has UNICEF, has the World Bank, has civil society engaged with us with the goal of trying to ensure that vulnerable populations everywhere will have access to life-saving populations. And that is a critical goal. This equity point that Samba said is absolutely critical. Now, when we started this program, we had no idea whether we could make a vaccine against this, and if so, if any of the technologies would work. And the timelines were thought to be quite long. The previous fastest vaccine was 4 years, and that was mumps, and then 5 years for Ebola that Tedros had just talked about. And so we thought maybe it could be, accelerated to 18 months. In fact, what's extraordinary, it was 326 days from the time of the publishment of the genome until the first product had a regulatory license, albeit for emergency usage. And it isn't just one vaccine. Now it's a handful of vaccines that have been approved. So, it is really extraordinary to see the progress science has made. But having a licensed vaccine is not enough to get us to global control. They need to be produced at scale. They need to be priced at an appropriate point. They need to be allocated globally so they're available where they're needed and can be used. And this road from vaccine research to rollout at scale is long, unpredictable, and fraught with challenges. It's one that Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, has played a transformational role, and it was set up again as an alliance with WHO, UNICEF, the World Bank. This was done about 21 years ago in 2000. And it's been extraordinarily successful at doing this. We've launched 496 new vaccines. And today, we've reduced vaccine preventable diseases by 70%, which is really extraordinary. But we've also taken on this issue of dealing with global health security. And so diseases such as yellow fever, meningitis, Japanese encephalitis, cholera, these are stockpiles that are available, and the Ebola vaccine that Tedros talked about earlier. And what's interesting about that is Ebola was a vaccine that didn't have a marketplace. So the challenge we had was how to create an artificial market for it. Problem we have with the COVID vaccine is demand that way exceeds supply, and of course, a market across the world. So where are we with this? Well, I would make the case that we are on track to have a different outcomes than the outcomes you heard about at the beginning of not having any access to developing countries, et cetera. Now, how has this worked? Well, we started out thinking, let's focus on the developing world because that's who will be left behind. But we realized if we just did that, as Nikki has said, maybe there wouldn't be any vaccine available to purchase for developing countries. So instead, we said, let's see if we could bring the world together. And we had no idea whether this would work, but much to our pleasure, we've ended up with 190 countries come together to work on COVAX. I'll say 190 plus one because the first day of the new Biden administration, it was announced that the US would join COVAX as well. We haven't yet worked through exactly what that means, although they've been very generous financially and in supporting the work we're doing. But this is really to pool global demand, to create volume guarantees, to move forward on advanced market commitments, and to work most importantly with industry, both in the public and private sectors, which we have done. So what's actually happened is we've reserved now more than 2 billion doses. And of those, at least 1.3 billion doses are set to go to developing countries. That may be as high as 1.8 billion doses if we can find additional finance for that. And those doses that are being supported by donor funding for 92 low and lower middle income countries should cover at least 20% of their population, although now estimates place us around 27%, and those numbers might rise. We've also set up a humanitarian buffer to enable access to COVID-19 vaccines for high-risk populations in humanitarian settings when they're at risk of being excluded or while governments and health ministries have no access due to conflict. And so, as you've heard from a number of the previous speakers, vaccines are rolling today, and over the next couple of weeks, you'll hear about many countries receiving vaccines. And this is ultimately going to turn into the largest and most rapid and likely most complex vaccine rollout in history. So this is a critical period for us. We obviously need to continue to make sure that we can secure more doses and more funding to pay for those doses. As you can expect in this early period when vaccines have only been rolled out in the last couple of months, the supply is limited and the competition is really fierce. Nikki talked about the vaccine nationalism problem. This is adding constraints on the supplies. But what are some of the other things? Well, we had to build from scratch an indemnification and liability system, a no-fault compensation scheme, even simple things like labeling vaccines so that they can be used in multiple different regions and countries and have some flexibility with that. But what we've really had to work on is make sure that every country is ready. And so there is a checklist, a dashboard that looks at, do they have the correct regulatory approvals? Is the country ready? The capacity to deliver? Is the supply chain ready to go? Do they have the appropriate cold chain, including ultra cold chain if necessary, delivery and logistics, syringes, et cetera? So very complicated, but is underway. You already heard a mention about public trust in government interventions and COVID vaccines. This is a big challenge due to vaccine hesitancy, but also the unusual gathering of, excuse me, conspiracy theorists in this time and the speed at which we've moved forward. So one critical thing is how we can be transparent and engage with the communities, as Samba has said, to make sure community leaders are with us. So all of this is going on now and is rapidly accelerating. But of course, one other thing has happened, and that has been the emergence of the SARS-CoV-2 variants. And this has also increased the risk of vaccine panic. We've seen around the world people desperately looking for vaccines, looking for new bilateral deals. And what's critical, as we've heard from the previous speakers, is that we have a system to do surveillance for these variants and understand what they mean and be able to then compare them to vaccines and figure out if we need to adapt and change the vaccines. Do we need to do boosters? Do we need to go back and revaccinate? Are the vaccines, good enough for where we are? And all of that has to happen globally so that we don't end up with the same situation again if new vaccines are required, that they'll go to the wealthy countries and leave out the rest of the world. So this is some of the challenges that we're dealing with. Of course, we've had fabulous commitments, including just last week at the G7 in terms of providing finance and political support, and now talking about donating early doses, given the large numbers of doses that wealthy countries have put aside. So just to finish, I'm an epidemiologist who has specialized in infectious disease epidemiology over my lifetime. And I have to say that it's critical that we get across the message. Science tells us there is no way out of this pandemic alone. We have to do it together or face what will be generational consequences. So COVID-19 becomes the biggest stress test of the multilateral system we've seen in decades. It's affected every person, every community, every country on Earth. In a global pandemic such as this, we're only safe if we're all safe. And we have to get this one right. So I look forward to the discussion that'll go on later. Over back to you, Phil.
Thank you for those comments. Our next speaker is Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. Dr. Sachs is University Professor and Director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, where he directed the Earth Institute from 2002 to 2016. Dr. Sachs is going to talk to us about the international financing of COVAX.
Thank you very much, Philip. Thanks, Seth. Thanks, Dr. Tedros, for being with us and sharing the latest information, and of course, for your leadership. We're not, science is doing an amazing job in this epidemic, and politics is doing, by and large, a pretty poor job. The scientific achievement of a vaccine within a year is a great triumph. Tedros explained to us, of course, that this is the result of years and years of research dependent on WHO, dependent on the world scientific community, going back to SARS, MERS, and all of Ebola and other path-breaking research that enabled vaccines in record time. Yet, when it comes to the actual political implementation of control, it's just a shocking nightmare that the United States just passed 500,000 deaths. Of course, we had the most psychopathic leader in the world and the worst president in our history until a few weeks ago. But I would say we just have been unbelievably bad at basic control measures. And I think what is stunning for me is that so much of the Asia Pacific has been able to suppress this pandemic, and Europe and the United States have been unable, or for whatever reason, incapable of doing the same thing. So the deaths in the Asia Pacific region are roughly a 50th per million population of the deaths in the North Atlantic region, US, Canada, and the European Union. We should really reflect on this. This is a massive, massive failure. When it comes to the vaccines, we're in also this paradoxical situation, astoundingly good science, ability to ramp up financing and production, and just even within the countries that have the vaccines, extraordinarily mediocre performance of actual deployment. And from a global systems point of view, good ideas and impediments at every moment. I would not concur with Seth when he says how great the G7 is to fill in a few $1 billion last week. To my mind, this is a remarkable failure, not a success. We're voting a $1.9 trillion package in a week or within the next few weeks in the United States. When you add up the emergency packages last March and December, this will be $5 trillion for the US alone of short-term funding. And yet Seth has to beg for $1 billion here or $1 billion there. And it's not about charity, for God's sake. It's about variants. It's about international transmission of the disease. It's just basic public health to get this properly funded. So I think that what we're watching in this past year is a shocking failure of Europe and the United States. And we're not past this point yet. What I do want to advocate for colleagues is a basic idea. And that is that the money that Act A and COVAX in particular needs is around $40 to $50 billion between now and the end of 2022. It makes no sense to dribble this out because Seth and Dr. Tedros need to develop the supply chains, and they need the lead times to do that. The lead times on actual distribution mechanisms, but especially the lead times on production and distribution of the vaccines, therapeutics, PPE, and so on. And this requires forward contracting. This cannot be done a month at a time. And that's why COVAX is scrambling right now. Everyone steps in front. COVAX's funding is inadequate. Everyone is outbidding. So we have a bidding war going on right now. And we don't have a plan till the end of 2022. And it's not good enough to have a plan till the end of 2021, because we'll arrive at the end of 2021 with a scramble for 2022. And the one thing I will tell you about market forces, without question, is they will leave half the world unvaccinated. So unless we get a system that is funded with a plan, a rational plan, all the rest is rhetoric. And for that, we need money in Seth's hands now, not of $5 billion, but of $40 or $50 billion for the forward contracts, the planning within the countries for delivery, and so on. So where can that money come from? First, it's a small amount of money. Please use the denominator 1.9 trillion about to be voted in the United States, or the trillions similarly being spent in the European Union. We're talking about rounding error, as usual when it comes to public health. So we need not to go cap in hand one country at a time, but to use the multilateral mechanisms. And the best place to do this is right now the International Monetary Fund, which is about to approve a new special drawing rights allocation. This creates reserve that can be turned into currency of about $600 billion. And the way that works is that 600 billion or so will be allocated to governments in proportion to their quota, which is basically their economic size at the IMF. Most of this money will go to the high-income rich countries, but those countries can then recycle the reserves that they receive into a special fund that could be allocated to ACT, Accelerator, and COVAX. And within one maneuver, we could have $40 or $50 billion committed within a few weeks that would enable Seth and colleagues to make the forward contracts and the rational plans of action. So this is under discussion right now. I'm trying to pursue this with all governments in the G20, with the US Treasury, with the IMF, and so forth. There's a real possibility for this, but what we really need is a rational plan till the end of 2022, the budget associated with it, a mechanism to deliver on that plan, and then the financing voted by the large countries through this mechanism at the International Monetary Fund, and put the money in hand. Just like we're not doing $1 billion here, $1 billion there for the US, we can't do the same thing. We can't try that method for COVAX. We need the tens of billions of dollars up front. So I will just underscore, let's keep our eye on the prize, which is mass coverage of immunizations, the mass ability to produce for variants, the money in hand at scale that's needed to accomplish this, and the recognition, which everyone on this call shares, that this must be inclusive. We can't even set goals, 20% coverage and so forth. We need to set goals for comprehensive coverage, plans to do that, the financing to do it, and then not let our politicians get away with token contributions, but put the money on the table with the institutions like the IMF that were created for this purpose. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Sachs. We'll go on to our last speaker, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. Martina Szabo is the lead of engagement and strategy at the COVID action platform of the World Economic Forum, and she will talk to us about the role of the World Economic Forum in vaccine distribution and access.
Thank you very much, Dr. Larussa. I hope everyone can hear me well.
Yeah, you're good.
Perfect. It's a pleasure to join you, and maybe a particular privilege as well to participate in the symposium in this capacity representing the forum, since I'm also an alumna of Columbia's Mailman School. So thank you again very much for the invitation and the chance to weigh in. I've been considering the other earlier presentations and actually reflecting as well on some of the points raised yesterday. So I wanted to start by recalling something that Dr. Tedros said. He said that money is not the only challenge that we face when it comes to COVID vaccines. And so in light of what's already been said, we are, as the World Economic Forum, also working to advocate for financing for the ACT Accelerator and emphasizing the importance of the economic case for global investments beyond ODA budgets. And we're also speaking with our business partners about how the private sector can be advocates for this message. But since Dr. Sachs has spoken about the financing questions, and I think we've also heard about many of the manufacturing or raw materials challenges from Dr. Lurie, I thought I might focus on some of the other challenges relating to vaccine distribution and access where the forum has a presence. And hopefully some of the remarks and observations that we've seen in the forum initiatives might provide some hope in comparison to what we've just heard on the financing side. So our work in this area is quite diverse because we've mobilized over 1,200 different organizations under the forum's umbrella, working on 40 different projects and initiatives relating to COVID response. And I thought I would share some thoughts about what we've seen from our efforts in global solutions in 3 areas. First, the key global health collaborations and multilateral instruments. What we've seen in terms of the necessary needs to amplify trusted information, and in particularly directly with business. And some of the specific challenges with vaccine distribution and access that our industry stakeholders have begun to form pre-competitive partnerships and work in partnership with COVAX and UNICEF and others to drive some change to these solutions on the ground. And before getting into that, I would as well like to frame, as Dr. Sow articulated so well, the need to think of this in an eye towards having a positive legacy. Because at the forum, through these initiatives, we've also been doing our best to have an eye towards the road ahead of what future pandemic preparedness initiatives can look like and how we can build, especially on our public-private engagement in the current collaborations to set the stage for a more secure state of global health security in the future. So we're very proud at the forum that we've helped launch many of the key global health institutions that are represented at the symposium this week. And that includes Gavi, the Global Fund, and most recently in 2017, CEPI. And we've continued to support them in their pandemic response, in particular as part of the Facilitation Council of the ACT Accelerator. And I would like to point out that it is fantastic that civil society and the private sector, either via the forum or through observers like the International Chamber of Commerce, they've had a seat at the table in the design of the ACT Accelerator instrument from the beginning, and they've been quite vocal contributors and contributing as well to the articulation of the economic investment case and strengthening the awareness, even among the general public, about what these multilateral instruments are aiming to achieve. So at the forum, we've also supported pledge events, and we're co-convening with the Gates Foundation and Industry Advisory Group in support of the diagnostics pillar. And I mention that because as well, some of our industry groups, in particular the supply chain and transportation industry group, have also organized additional support, pre-competitive support for COVAX and UNICEF. And I'll return to that in a moment. And I pick up on the global communications platform and the advocacy there that we've been doing in partnership with WHO, CEPI, Gavi, and other partners, because we've been receiving, frankly, in this context of the digital presence of our platform, over 60 million views of different social videos that we've been using to raise awareness of ACT Accelerator. And we've seen here as well the need for our partners from the vaccine industry to also use the forum and other platforms to communicate updates on vaccine development and deployment and to speak to the evolution of clinical trials. And yesterday, and I'm sure that it will be raised throughout this week this goal that we are also very supportive of at the forum to move towards a future pandemic preparedness state in which we could develop vaccines in 100 days, to go from a genome sequence to a vaccine that could be considered for emergency use in only 3 months. And I know that people like Jeremy Farrar yesterday even noted shorter timelines of 7 days. But on that point, and on the point of the forum's platform and communication with the general public, vaccines won't work if people won't take them. And if they're not in full confidence about the fact that vaccines are trusted and they can have faith in the science and the process behind them. So Dr. Szabo also touched on this point, and the fact that building vaccine confidence has never been more important as well. So we've been working to not only work with business partners like Ipsos, where we might see a more traditional role for business to assist with public opinion polls and understanding where the concerns of the public might lie. And I know that there will be more in-depth conversations on vaccine take-up later this week. But particularly on the topic of this 100-day or 7-day goal, these moonshot challenges, we've seen in our work with the Vaccine Confidence Project and others with large employers that there's a new need for the business sector, but for all of us to communicate with the public to tackle the information sharing and misinformation challenge that have really been raised. And I know that Seth also pointed towards this. So the unprecedented demand for COVID vaccines seems to have gone hand in hand as well with an unprecedented growth in some of these concerns about misinformation that have been challenges for a pandemic response since this time last year. And we've been working on that at the forum and would be keen to make sure that the solutions developed today increase the confidence of the public in not only the multilateral institutions, but in science and the processes behind developing vaccines in the future. So finally, being a bit more specific on where the forum is directly working on the topic of vaccine distribution through our working groups. It was Seth Berkeley just mentioned that this is the most rapid and complex distribution in history. And I would point to recalling some of the specific industry groups that I mentioned to some concrete partnerships that are underway. And for example, this looks like the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, working in ASEAN countries, because a global solution to the demand for COVID vaccines, I think, needs to get quite practical on the ground. So the Global Alliance is working to undertake efforts that look quite practically like assessing import practices, to do tabletop tests of actually running dummy shipments through import and border controls, and actually testing if the cold chain can meet the requirements of vaccines when they arrive. And so this as well goes to the point that Dr. Sachs was making about the need to achieve forward planning many months in advance, so that partnerships like what the Global Alliance is doing in the ASEAN region can tackle some of the very practical solutions on the ground. So I trust, and as well I know presentations on Friday from speakers like Stanley Bergman and John Nkengasong will also touch on this, but I wanted to flag. And lastly, I wanted to point to work that our supply chain and transportation industry at the forum has done, because I think this is as well a bright spot in the global solutions here. We have a group of very committed CEOs representing the supply chain and transportation industry from around the world, and they meet regularly, and they've been focusing on identifying very concrete ways that business, and this industry in particular, can contribute to the access challenges and support UNICEF and COVAX with their equal distribution objectives. So we're all aware that the cold chain logistics solutions are central to distributing vaccines, and in particularly that these pose delivery challenges in the global south. So in partnership with UNICEF and IATA, business leaders from aviation, the marine industry, and landside transport ecosystem partners are working pre-competitively, and they've signed a charter in support of UNICEF and the COVAX facility. And UNICEF has anticipated that now that the COVID vaccine rollout has begun as of today, up to 850 tons of COVID vaccines will be shipped per month. So even if we set aside the COVID cold storage requirements, there are some real challenges and strains that are being placed on our shipping and transportation system, and they're already strained. And this is just when we're thinking about vaccine tonnage, never mind the billions syringes or the 10 million safety boxes for disposal. It's quite a practical problem. And so this global supply chain and transportation group has signed a charter in support of UNICEF, and now it's actually become quite concrete with proposals for pro bono support and mapping needs for UNICEF and COVAX to actually carry out logistics personnel and activities on the ground and share some operational assistance at the regional and country levels. So I would point to these and we'll return to the point earlier that the global solutions that we're developing for vaccines now need certainly to be designed with an eye towards the future and with the solidarity principles in mind. But reflecting on the forum's activities, it's not just a question of solidarity between nations or in a geopolitical sense, but it's also between the public, private, and civil society stakeholders, where everyone needs to be at a seat at the table from the onset, because many of these solutions can only be provided when we work together in that way. So I would turn my time back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Well, we finished a little bit ahead of schedule, so we have plenty of time for discussion. You've all pointed out the not only the extent of the problem we face, but the solutions and the methods we need to use to solve this problem. And it as often it is, the science is the easiest part of this, and the political will and societal will to do what we have to do remains to be addressed. One of the things I'm concerned about is we've talked about the extent of the problem that we face right now in terms of dealing with the situation as it is, but we already know a number of variants have emerged. You've all alluded to this, and I imagine the amount of pressure in terms of funding and manufacturing base that will need to address this continued problem of retooling vaccines as time goes on, especially if our rollout is sluggish as it is now, and which will give the virus more time to replicate and to mutate. So can we talk a little bit about where you see this going as far as creating the manufacturing base and the technological know-how to address this, not only the problem we have now, but the problem we're going to face as time goes on and these variants emerge? And maybe we'll start off with Dr. Tedros. Do you want to make a few comments about that? I think maybe we've lost Dr. Tedros. Dr. Berkley?
Sure, and then maybe I'll turn it over to Nikki. The first thing we have to say is we don't yet know absolutely that we will need new vaccines, although obviously there's a lot of hypothesis around this. And I think there's a bunch of unknowns that sit with that. First of all, are these vaccines, what's the duration of protection? Are these vaccines that are going to last for a long time? Will we need revaccinations anyway? Will the high risk groups need to be covered? But as we think about it, and assuming that we want to move to new vaccines, what are the consensus sequences or ways that we would approach that? Is that going to be about, bringing together and having multivalent vaccines? Is that going to be about shifting completely to different antigens? Are we going to be doing booster doses on the vaccines that were existing? So there are many, many different questions associated, that need to be worked out scientifically. But our assumption right now is we will need to have some changes of the vaccines, and there probably will need to be some type of additional vaccine production. And what that means is that we have to go from where we are now to scale that up, and that is going to be a challenge. Now, the good news is we have a lot of exciting new technology that potentially can be used for this, and things like mRNA vaccines that can be adapted quickly, maybe can be used in lower dose. But I think, the challenge we have to think about, and I love Jeff's vision for this, is, having the ability to retool and do that. And just to put that into perspective, we're talking already about the largest expansion of vaccine production that's occurred in history in 1 year. And it may be that we have to, almost do it again. And so what that's going to require is countries working together and making sure that there is adequate finance, adequate supplies, et cetera, to move it forward. I don't know, Nikki, if you want to add to that.
No, thanks, Seth. And maybe I'll just make a couple of additional comments, because I think, as you indicated, we are sort of planning against a number of scenarios, right, from the best case to the worst case. And we need to be doing that now, so that if we really need to move forward in one way or another with vaccines against variants, that we're prepared to do that in every way. So if in fact we need more manufacturing than we are planning on now, because you need, additional doses, booster doses and all that, the identifying and bringing online additional manufacturing sites is going to be really important. It's fair to say that CEPI's done a pretty decent assessment of vaccine manufacturing capacity around the world, and there is excess capacity out there. Still, the challenge is that right now, the large companies that have got established vaccines are really hesitant to form partnerships with particularly with some of the developing country manufacturers. So we can't even unleash all the capacity that exists right now for a whole variety of reasons that have to be addressed. Secondly, this issue about the supply chain that both Seth and I mentioned is really, really, really important. Right now, one of the companies that is set to be one of the largest producers of vaccines from COVAX tell us that they have enough filters to be able to manufacture in one of their facilities for 2 weeks. And in a survey of all of these companies, everyone indicated they are living hand to mouth. So it's not only the vaccine manufacturers, but it's going to be all of these suppliers of all the components that go into making vaccines that are really, really stressed at this point. And just as we had no system to help our vaccine manufacturers scale up and buy raw materials, all these guys are similarly reticent to do the same thing, because they have no idea whether there's going to be a market for them after they do this. And so they feel like they're taking a lot of risk, and they're also looking for additional financing. So none of that stuff is a straight shot. And then the third part gets back to this set of issues about vaccine nationalism, et cetera. And that's that increasingly, as we start to see action against the variant vaccines, what we're seeing is a lot of sense that this is going to be an endemic disease, that this is going to be a commercial market, that we're not as worried about this for a pandemic as we are long-term. And unlike the situation when at least CEPI first got into this and formed this partnership with Gavi and WHO, where we could say, gosh, one of the conditions that goes with our financing is right of first refusal for COVAX in terms of doses. Now these companies sort of feel like they can do it on their own, and they can go ahead and cut bilateral deals. And we've already seen, in fact, the first sets of bilateral deals for new variant vaccines being made. And so here we are once again. We have admired the problem now for a year. We've worked really hard on solving it. To Seth's point, to Jeff's point especially, we got to get the financing in place. So if we're going to need to do this, Gavi can go ahead now, in some sense, really cut all these deals, but it doesn't even have the funding it needs now to procure doses, let alone procure variant doses, booster doses, multivalent doses, et cetera. So that's going to challenge all of our sense of global health security in a whole bunch of ways. Over.
I wonder, Nicole, Philip, could I come in just ask Nicole a question about
Sure.
this issue about companies not ready to partner with the spare capacity in developing countries. Just if you could say another word about that.
Well, I'll confess I haven't taken a really deep dive into it, but a lot of it is that companies have their own supply chains, their own quality systems, their own everything that they've got finely tuned, and they don't want to risk any regulatory compromise for any of their other products or anything else by partnering with new partners. Secondly, many of them feel like they're taking a reputational risk working with developing country manufacturers. And again, they don't feel that they have total control over their supply chain and supply chain quality in terms of doing this. So I think those are some of the barriers and impediments. But at least from, within CEPI, we've got the whole sustainable manufacturing team. And, they remain pretty convinced that there is excess untapped capacity around the world to go ahead and make vaccine if manufacturers are willing to make the partnerships and we can get everybody activated. And that's going to have to go hand in hand now with this raw material thing, which sounds mundane, but it is really quite serious at this point.
I think this comes to another issue that is just worth mentioning, which is the intellectual property rights issue, which is in front of WTO. If in fact there's excess capacity that is not being taken up for any of these reasons, the pressures on just compulsory licensing of all kinds will grow enormously. I think companies should understand that their real reputational risk is not partnering in developing countries, but failing to do so. So I hope that they could be educated about the other side of this story.
I think the point is spot on and is a really important one. I'm not sure that we're totally in the business of doing this, but also want to comment that the tech transfer and the know-how to make vaccines is really, really different than it is to make drugs and small molecules. So unless you've really got willing partners on both sides, it's gonna take a really, really long time. And so I don't think in general that the major issue is about IP. There's been a lot of willingness to license, but even the companies right now that are tech transferring to multiple sites are really stretched to the limit. And I won't say struggling, but it's pretty hard to get everything right. And that's a process that can take years, and we just don't have that kind of time.
Yeah, and I would say struggling. I mean, many of the companies that are now spread out and doing tech transfers, you say to them, here's a great opportunity to do another tech transfer to a company. And they just say, literally, we have nobody who can do that right now. It's not that we don't want to, it's not that we don't understand the importance of it, but there's a set number of people who have this expertise and we just can't do it right now.
Yeah, and I'll just, as a data point, Jeff, back when I worked on H1N1 in the US government, we had a problem at one point with a contaminant in one of the vaccines that was being made by a well-known company, and it was in another country. When we looked to see who could help them solve this problem, we were able to identify 7 people in the world with the expertise. I'm not kidding. And they were all people like over the age of 70. And so just to say the expertise for doing this around the world is also just really limited. And they're pretty tapped out.
I appreciate that fully. I just think.
Yeah. Well, Szabo, do you want to make any comments?
Yeah, sorry.
Ms. Szabo?
Yes, well, I wanted to, not to change the focus, but to point to also some of the challenges behind your question on the variants, because tracking variants effectively will require better, or in some cases more where none exist, agreements on data sharing of DNA sequences and actually priming our diagnostic tools to screen for variants. And at the moment, we're very much missing standardized data analysis, sharing and reporting policies, and this is around the world, but also on the regional level. So when it comes to an ambition to actually outline a roadmap for potential variants, if we do need to see if we need new vaccines, there are still quite a bit of pieces for collaboration that are missing ahead of that. And I think that goes back to the point that Dr. Sow mentioned, when we need to be working now in the sense of strengthening our healthcare systems going forward. These kinds of sequencing or surveillance networks and capacities are exactly what we need for pandemic preparedness in the future, and could be exactly what we need to tackle the variants at the moment.
Dr. Sow, do you want to comment about the pressure that both the pandemic and the efforts to stem the pandemic are putting on other healthcare initiatives? And then maybe the rest of you could chime in. You talked about inadequate supplies to test for COVID, but we spend a lot of time and effort on childhood immunizations, maternal child health, other things like that. And is the focus shifting away from ongoing problems that we still need to address? I think
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So, yes, I did mention this, and I fully agree with all the comments made here by our previous speaker, Seth, and Professor Lurie and Ms. Szabo. It is clear that without adequate testing, adequate surveillance system in difficult areas, that this pandemic will end up becoming an endemic in many countries in low middle income zones, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa. We're seeing, for example, there have been some diseases. They stayed here in Africa forever. Even with vaccines, they will keep coming back and forth. Ebola, for example, in Africa. So we got to be very careful. To me, COVID, we're not seeing COVID in Africa is not telling me that there is no COVID in Africa, for example. It tells me that we need to look still carefully and be careful. Are we really looking for this? That's one. And two, we are very timid. We are very silent on variants. It's just because there is no infrastructure to look for this. Our laboratories, we do not have enough capacity. Some places in Africa, we are saying we have centers of excellences, a very performant research center. That's very few. It doesn't cover Africa. Those centers will even not cover the entire country that is hosting them. I mean, I know South Africa and Northern Africa, Southern Africa, just say South Africa and Northern Africa are doing quite well. But even with those countries, they are not able to cover entirely what they need to cover. So when you come into the Central and Sub-Saharan Africa, Western and Eastern Africa, that's where you have issues. So we have to work together to build these capacities, to test as we can, and to sequence. Sequencing is completely almost not being done in many places in Africa. And also communication. I would like to end, because I wouldn't repeat what have been said already, but communication. You can have the most powerful vaccine and tools to fight against your pathogen. But if you don't translate well the usefulness and the need and of that tool, you may not be, people will just not use it. And then you will still end up suffering with that same pathogen. So what I'm trying to say here is communication is key. Today, there are many issues in African countries around communication, around infodemic, around bad rumors in our communities. So we need to build around that, make sure people will accept this vaccine, and make sure we explain well around variants. Because even our decision makers, they don't know enough about the COVID itself, and they don't even know about variants. They are saying we don't have those variants here. Those variants are only for those variants are only for Western countries. We in Africa, there is no variants. It's only in South Africa. We don't know that, for example, in Mali. That's not true. It's because we're not looking for it. That's what I would add to what have been said so far. And for us to do that, last word is we have to build around the existing healthcare system. We have to combine, we have to come together as a global team. We have to work hard in a much global way. And thank you for organizing such a great meeting and for having somebody very far away from a developing world. And I think this is the best way to go. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your comments, and we're honored to have you. Do any of you want to add to those comments?
Well, I mean, Samba is actually right, and we have to think about what's happening. During the early days of the pandemic, we saw, a massive reduction in, for example, vaccination against other diseases, again, visits to clinics. We saw, deliveries occurring at home and not in facilities. And this, has luckily, a lot of this has come back, but they're still down before, to where they were before the pandemic began. And one of the critical things is that if we don't catch up, if we don't work to rebuild these systems quickly, we could end up with, pandemics that could make overwhelm the health system even more and increase the problems that we have in front of us. So, the critical thing here, and I think Samba put it right, is that we have to take advantage of the pandemic to not only do what we can to get the tools out and to work hard to get them used, but also to build the system better for the future, because it's going to be evolutionarily certain not only that we have the existing infectious diseases, but we're going to have more infections, and how to make sure that we're in good position to do that is something that's very important.
I might just add that if you look at countries that have struggled with lots of outbreaks, over the recent decade, those countries are doing pretty well with their ability to do surveillance, to put in place public health measures to stem this. In some sense, it's the really the high income, most developed countries, partly because of leadership issues, but partly because of other things that haven't done that. And so it's a really good reminder that you can't just build a one-off system, but you have to be building a system for everything for now and the future. And that includes primary care and public health and blending those two wherever possible.
So, you've all talked about what countries should do and actually what they really must do. And you've talked about the kinds of political and other negotiations that you've had with them. Are there international legal ramifications or through the UN that could be used to help countries move along this path to doing not only the right thing, but what they should do? I don't know if any of you want to take that question.
Well, Jeff knows better than anybody that prior to this, we were on a pathway to the SDGs and we were trying to move there. And he's made a similar articulate case about the lack of financing, the lack of commitment, the lack of engagement to move us there. But we've all of a sudden had this massive kick, and we don't know how bad it's going to be, but it's already bad. And are we going to get back on, any form of track towards that? And I think that's going to take enormous global solidarity to do that.
I would add just a couple of thoughts. One is that we really need to resist confrontations between the US, China, Russia right now. And the kind of rudeness going on in both directions between China and the US, but especially from the US towards China, is so detrimental to making basic progress in any of these multilateral settings that we need to chill out, understand that the United States was a terrible actor last year, a terrible, disgraceful actor, and that we need to come back to a cooperative setting. Second, there are a number of venues that are very important for this. The G20 finance ministers will be meeting shortly, extremely important. The IMF is critical, as I explained, because it can take action quickly. And it was set up in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference for exactly an emergency need. And here we are with an emergency need. I think that the normative and advisory role of WHO is indispensable. The point that I also believe is crucial for us to emphasize is that the good behavioral lessons from the Asia Pacific have not reached enough of the rest of the world, and that needs to be understood. And WHO, I think, plays an essential role in spreading best practices. So this is another area where we really can make headway. I don't see fundamental barriers now that we have a rational president. We really can do something together. The money is absolutely essential for the next steps, and we should focus on getting that piece done. Then I think Martina was very eloquent. It's not enough, but without it, forget it. So we really need to get this in hand now. And what everybody is saying is we will have catastrophe if this becomes endemic in the world. And as the public health leaders that I'm speaking to, making this case to the politicians who are generally the last to know almost anything. There is a way to get this under control. It requires decisive action. Here is the price tag. Here is a plan of action for the next year and a half. Don't shirk on this and don't cut corners, because the costs could be horrendous for doing so, is, I believe, our best hope. And I know that the UN would be completely around that narrative, because it's a true one.
You know, I think this other point that you're making, I just want to highlight it, Jeff, because it's a little bit nuanced. And that's that a lot of the discussion has been, how much do you need for R&D? How much do you need to buy vaccines? How much do you need to distribute vaccines? How much do you need for diagnostics? The question is, what is the cost to get this under control? And how are we going to come up with the money? What is the cost to end this pandemic period? And I think, one of our colleagues at USAID framed this for us the other night too. And I think it was just, really welcome thinking to let's look at this problem much more holistically and differently and say, what does the world need to do this? And then let's go about doing it. So I'm totally on board with that thinking, but I think just calling attention to the difference from where we've been to where that is really, really important.
Let's see, we have a comment here from Ames Dye. Can you unmute yourself?
I didn't know I had a comment.
You had your hand up. Would you like to say something?
Oh.
Just
I
waving.
wonder how that happened. I'll lower it. So,
hello.
But now that you've got me on the floor, yeah, I'd like to ask a question. And, we've said a lot about, there has been a lot said about financing and a lot from the WTO. I'd just like to hear some comments maybe from Jeffrey on India and South Africa's application to the WTO in terms of the TRIPS waiver and what the status of that is at the moment, and whether you think that that is something that's possible and could work. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, the idea of the TRIPS waiver is that under the TRIPS rules, there is an explicit understanding that public health emergencies allow workarounds around intellectual property rights, that the public health standard must take precedents. This is why I also raised the question, what are the barriers to scaling up right now? In pragmatic terms, I think what we heard was that the real issues of scale up are not so much the matters of intellectual property, but are the matters of proper planning and arrangements and enabling environment. I'm prepared to believe that. And often you could end the IP rights and not make any practical difference of supply availability. So those who view the IP waiver as a key are probably mistaken. On the other side, those who view IP as sacrosanct are also mistaken. IP is a tool, and it's recognized now for the last 20 years, in essence, resulting from the AIDS history, that IP rights can be overruled in the case of public health emergencies. But what I believe to be the real issue here is a focal plan that is agreed and financed. And that may not involve anything about IP, though it could absolutely involve more partnerships between the vaccine producers and production facilities in India or in other countries. That may be a very important part of the practical answer. But if we don't have a plan, and if it's not financed, every magic solution, realistic or unrealistic, will be on the table. We will have no legitimacy. We will have no structure. So this is the time to get the plan and the financing in place. And that probably does not require IP waivers, but it probably requires partnerships of production and ways to address the practical considerations that Nicole raised a few minutes ago, for example. And that can be done if there are lead times of 9 to 12 months for the kind of scaling up of production capacity, facilities, and so forth that are needed. So again, rational planning for this emergency over a period of 24 months, basically, in other words, till the end of 2023, I think is imperative to address all of these technical issues.
I mean, the other thing, Jeff, just to add to that is of course, opportunity cost. And that is a really important issue. So, you know, I agree with Nikki completely that there is no, IP is not the problem. It's know-how, and you need that type of working relationship to move forward. But, you know, if we want to get all the capacity there, what you're going to need to do is have you know, somebody work to make sure that people accept the fact that there is going to be a situation where, you know, people are either eating opportunity costs or paid for those opportunity costs. And that's been a huge barrier in the past in terms of doing things. Of course, you know, I very selfishly want to make sure companies still make vaccines for the other diseases, and we have to make sure they don't compromise there. But when you go to a company and say, take all your vaccine manufacturing now that's excess that's there and use it to make a vaccine of your competitor to help the world get there, you're also not working on your next generation vaccines, your R&D portfolio. So there are real trade-offs and opportunity costs. And in the past, when we've, you know, been given the bills for those, you know, where people said, here's what we would expect to have pay, they didn't pass the laugh test. So, you know, but it is a real challenge in thinking about this.
Dr. James, did you want to make a comment?
Yes, so this is Wilmar James. I'm a co-convener of the symposium. I just wanted to say that Ames Dye is who asked that question inadvertently, put her hand up. She's a bioethicist from the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and a panelist tomorrow in the session with Melinda Gates. So, so that was Ames by way of introduction. I wanted to make a comment about politicians as a former politician myself, and Jeff brought this up as a point about reaching out to politicians to do the right things. I used to be a member of parliament in South Africa, but I was not in government. I was on the opposition side. And I make that point because the WHO is a body of governments, the United Nations is a body of governments. And if you want to reach all politicians, you have to go beyond governments. And it's very important to do that because politicians worldwide have constituencies. And those constituencies are the ones you want to reach. So a special effort has to be made to have an outreach program that's quite deliberate to all politicians. And there are ways of doing that. There's International Parliamentary Union, there's a Commonwealth Parliamentary Association of all Commonwealth countries. There's the Global Parliamentarians for Action, and a range of other networks. Politicians control budgets, they pass legislation, they have constituencies. We talk about risk communication around vaccine take-up and being able to get to ordinary people and citizens who don't often have access to the right information. And if you want to reach them, you reach them through the political world. And so just to say that one of the things we need to take on board in a much more deliberate and decisive way is an outreach program to all politicians on a national level, regional level, and local level as part of the overall effort. So that was a comment more than a question, but I would love to get a response from Jeff as well.
Jeff, are you there? I think we may have lost Jeff. Dr. Tedros, are you still there? Jeff, you're on mute. Okay. Well, we're approaching the end of our session. I would ask you, we've had really a very interesting discussion about a number of issues and how to address them. Do any of you want to make any final comments before we close?
And I think the only comment I would make is we are all, continuing to grapple with the current situation and its implications for the next year or two. This is also the time for us to be thinking about the way we want the world to look going forward. And obviously there are a lot of groups that already started meeting and convening and all of those sorts of things. When I ran disasters to the US government, I would always say, never let a good disaster go to waste. We have a narrow window of opportunity to think about how we're going to fix this for the future before the world decides once again to forget and move on. And it's hard for me sitting in the US with 500,000 people dead to imagine that we could forget, but I fear that we will. And so as crazy it is for everybody right now, this is the time to be thinking really, really hard and getting in place agreements for the kind of system that we want to manage the next pandemic going forward. Over.
Other comments?
I mean, I fully agree with what Nikki just said. And I think, we have an amazing opportunity now to pivot to new technologies, new ways of working, but we have to do it building upon what Samba talked about. I mean, this is a moment, and I'll use this for 2 minutes to just say something. Immunization is the most widely distributed of all health interventions. It gets to, about 90% of the population, but that means the last 10% it doesn't. And if you don't get immunizations, you don't have anything. So this is also an opportunity for us to reach out to that last mile. 50% of the deaths occur in that 10%. 2/3 of that 10% lives below the poverty line. And that that's where pandemics are going to start, like the 2015 one in Guinea on Ebola, where it spread for 3 months before anybody figured out what it was because they were outside of a health system. So I think the challenge for us is to invest in the technology and the systems and the tools, but then to make sure it reaches everybody. And that universality is going to be critical, because as population grows, as climate change occurs, as urbanization occurs, we're going to have more and more outbreaks, and we need to be prepared for that. And frankly, we were lucky this occurred in China. You can discuss details exactly on who reported when, but as you heard, in 2 weeks, they published the genomic sequence of the virus, and people were off to making vaccines immediately. That we won't be so lucky if that occurs in probably the community that Samba Sow is right now in, and that's what we really have to build up, is the combination of science, technology, but also access for everybody. Over.
Thank you. All right, well, I'd like to thank all our speakers for not only their presentations, but their comments, and for staying around for the discussion. I want to close the session, but remind everyone that tomorrow's session is on ethical and societal challenges, and please join us again tomorrow. Thank you again, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.